I think having worked across kind of this whole healthcare spectrum between clinical laboratory science and academia and public health, it gave me a really interesting perspective where I got the opportunity to see how each of those roles can come into play when it comes to stewardship. And they're really, I know bridging the gap is kind of a buzz term now, but that's really how I felt since I've moved from the clinical lab to my position now, is that I just see this big gap where we could try to think about ways that laboratory medicine or laboratory science and clinical infectious disease medicine can come together to just do better stewardship and better patient care. And so that's just something I'm really passionate about. And I think it's fun that I've gotten to train a bit on both sides. And so I think it brings a unique perspective, and I talk about it any chance I get. Yes, this is actually the study that I referenced there is a JAMA study from Dr. Morgan and team out of University of Maryland, I believe. And I think this is just a really fascinating study because what they did here was they sent a survey out to hundreds of providers in the primary care setting, asking them about the probability of disease for some pretty common things that you would see in that setting. So, for example, pneumonia, urinary tract infections, cardiac ischemia, and breast cancer screening. I think those were the four major ones. And asked providers, clinicians, to estimate the probability of disease in these groups before and after testing. And I just think it's a great study because it kind of points out our human error and the things that folks are taught in medical school and maybe what isn't emphasized as much. And when it comes to the use of diagnostic tests, there's a lot of probability work, kind of statistics work you have to do in your mind. In a perfect world, you would be doing that every time you make a diagnosis, but that's not always happening. So it's a really great study in terms of helping us think through why we would need diagnostic tests and then maybe other things we should think about after we get a diagnostic test result. So in terms of visibility in stewardship in hospital settings in particular, I feel like the folks that are least visible or who are lacking visibility the most would be clinical laboratorians. And I know that I'm biased there, but particularly clinical microbiologists. I will say that this is including everyone that you think should be on the team is easier said than done. These stewardship teams are not always funded to accommodate that. It's often, at least in my experience, the stewards that I've worked with are phenomenal and have so much respect for clinical laboratorians and absolutely see their value. It's just that sometimes you are only allotted funding for an ID pharmacist, PharmD, and infectious disease clinician, or 2 PharmDs, or, and every once in a while you'll see these really nice big committees that've got a microbiologist on them and, 3 or 4 or 5 people. But that is not, I don't think that's terribly common. So it's certainly not for lack of love, I don't think, but it's hopefully in the future, I think that I would love to see these stewardship committees and teams really rounding out with a clinical microbiologist on board and having a seat at that table. So I think in particular, adding microbiologists to a stewardship committee would really help with the diagnostic component. But then of course too, education, by itself has not really been demonstrated in the literature to make a huge impact on stewardship outcomes. But when you've rolled it in with other interventions as part of a stewardship program, it can be really impactful. And I think from my own experiences, I've always noted that when you pull in clinical microbiologists to do some of the teaching, so not just having clinicians doing clinical education, but also having clinical microbiologists teach about laboratory focused things, about the use of diagnostics, about how these things work and what kind of specimens we need and why, it actually makes a really big difference in the hospital setting in terms of how relationships work, how communication is improved between the laboratory and clinical practice. There's a lot of ways to kind of connect that link, and I think just adding a laboratorian to the committee would help in bridging that gap. Data and analytics and how they're helping bridge the gap. There is a lot to say here, so I'm not going to go on forever about it. But I think there's some key things that I would mention. Some of them are a little more straightforward. So things like creation of antibiograms have gotten easier. So 14 or so years ago, when I was first in the lab and was trying to help put together the antibiogram, I was doing it by hand and like tabulating things. It's not like we didn't have technology. It was just our process at the time. Doing a lot by hand. It was very messy. How nice is it now that these cumulative antibiograms are kind of compiled in real time? That's been really amazing for helping with understanding of local prevalence and burden of certain resistance patterns and organisms. That's really beneficial to the laboratory because it'll impact the way testing is done. It'll impact, honestly, the procedures around how cultures are worked up. On the clinical side, that's obviously going to impact things like empiric treatment and guiding clinicians towards what they know is present in their community and how they might want to manage a patient before they have more information. So that's been really wonderful. Data monitoring and tracking, both for patient care and for things like quality improvement in the laboratory. That's been a really big deal. That's really helped kind of link the clinical side to the laboratory side. And then I would just emphasize how beautiful the literature is looking for things like rapid diagnostic, molecular rapid diagnostic testing, especially for blood cultures or for sepsis. There's some really great literature recently out there that's demonstrated how data from these testing platforms are directly impacting clinical practice. And I think that's really awesome, because what I'd love to see are these really rapid tests that also are contributing data that help with both public health and management of the patient in the clinical setting, like in the hospital.